Welcome to I Love to Tell the Story, a podcast on the narrative lectionary. I'm Rolf Jacobson.
I'm Kathryn Schifferdecker.
And I'm Karoline Lewis.
And today we're talking about Exodus 16, the story of Manna. This is the podcast for October 5th, 2025. And we're in the story of the Exodus. So last week we had the story of the burning bush and the call of Moses, which he protests, but finally goes to Pharaoh to tell him to let God's people go. And, of course, the giving of God's name, I am who I am. So now we've obviously skipped over the story of the 10 plagues and the story of Passover. The people are now newly in the wilderness. They haven't yet actually come to Mount Sinai, but they're getting hungry, and they're already, even after all the signs and wonders that God has done and the crossing of the Red Sea, they want to go back to Egypt. The whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the fleshpots and ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. So they're hangry, to say the least.
That's a good line.
Yeah. Good one, yes.
They are hungry. You brought us out here just to kill us, God. And then God provides.
Yeah, this is my life verse, of course, as you know.
Yeah.
About the flesh pots, when you guys were in confirmation or whatever, did you get to pick a confirmation verse?
My pastor chose it for me.
I was going to say my dad
Yeah.
was my confirmation teacher because he was the pastor, and I believe he chose it for me. And
my dad was a confirmation pastor, and we didn't do verses.
Oh,
I don't know why.
All right.
But if we did, I'd want this verse.
All right.
It's a great verse about human nature that, first of all, freedom is hard.
Yeah.
They've just been freed, and freedom and following the Lord are hard.
Mm-hmm.
And most of us would prefer to be enslaved but taken care of over being free and not knowing if we're going to be taken care of. But so I think there's something profound. I mean, one of the reasons I love this story, and I named my band The Fleshpots of Egypt after this, is because I do think it's a great anthropology about what we're really like.
Isn't that cool that you can say my band?
Yeah.
Well,
Not many
you.
people can say that. My band.
You define it, bluegrass.
It's a
I'm
Lutheran.
just saying, that's really cool to be able to say band.
It
Anyway,
is,
keep
it
going.
is.
Thank you. And of course, my theory in life is always be the weakest member of any sports team or musical group you're in, because then you look better. And I am. But then, of course, then what's God's response going to be to a people who complains and doesn't show faith? And it's going to be to provide for them.
Yeah.
Again, sort of like Genesis 22, the God who provides.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I was just thinking about that. That's an important connection that preachers could make.
Yeah.
And do we have the line here? I can't remember where it is, where they go, what is it?
Yeah, it's in verse 15. So God provides both quails for meat and this bread of heaven that rains down from heaven. And in verse 15, when the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, what is it? For they did not know what it was.
And how do you say what is it in Hebrew?
Manna.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember when my
Well, manhu, but yes.
Close enough.
Yeah.
But when my son was little once, anybody who's raised kids has this experience of a strange food is put in front of them. They go, what's that?
Yeah, exactly.
And that's exactly the Israelites' reaction. And Karoline, I can't for the life of me imagine if there's any connection to John here.
Yeah, that's a tough one. The suggested verse is John 6:51, which is the bread of life discourse. If you're in the RCL, it's always in the year of Mark,
like 5
year B,
weeks.
5 weeks of the bread of life discourse. But the bread of life discourse is Jesus' interpretation of the feeding of the 5,000. So the feeding of speaking of signs, feeding of the 5,000 is one of the signs. But the sign itself is never really the miraculous thing in the Gospel of John. It's what it points to. And in the case of the feeding of the 5,000, it points to who Jesus is, Jesus' identity as. And the verse is 8:51, I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever. And the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. But prior to that, Jesus has said, I am the bread of life. I am the bread that came down from heaven. Then Jesus says, I am the living bread that came down from heaven. And so while pastors or preachers are usually like, oh my goodness, how much more can I talk about bread? Each revelation that Jesus makes in response to the feeding of the 5,000 reveals more and more of Jesus' identity as God who provides and has always provided. And preachers might remember that there is no Lord's Supper in the Gospel of John, that really the provision of Jesus' own body, the flesh, this is my flesh, my blood to drink and my flesh to eat is here in John 6, and how John is working out this entire story as part of his Christology. So it's a really important text for John. Really important story, and again, fundamental to revealing the character of who God is as provider and provider of life.
Yeah. No, that's helpful. The setting of the story in Exodus, right at the beginning of the wilderness wanderings, 40 years in the wilderness, God provides manna throughout those 40 years, right? It says once they are ready to cross into the promised land, that's when the manna stops in Joshua. And just the idea of that provision, that wilderness period is so central to the story of Israel, right? In the wilderness is where the law is given. In the wilderness is where Israel learns to live with that freedom that you talked about earlier, Rolf. Yeah, it's really difficult to learn how to live as a free people. And the wilderness is the place of testing, certainly, but it's also the place, later on in Hosea, the wilderness is understood as the honeymoon period, where God and Israel learn to, or I should say God already loves Israel, but Israel learns to love God and to obey God and to trust God. Manna is about trust. That, even in the middle of this barren wilderness, and if you've ever seen pictures of the Sinai wilderness, barren is an optimistic way of talking about it, right?
It's an understatement.
It's an understatement. That's a good way of putting it. Yeah, it's to trust that God will provide day to day. Give us this day our daily bread, right? It's that kind of trust. And my own seminary teacher, Ellen Davis, writes beautifully about this in her book, Scripture, Culture, and Agriculture, where she talks about the manna economy, right? Manna economy is a place of trust and of everyone having enough. So at the end in verse 18, the end of the passage we suggest, the Israelites gathered it, some gathering more, some less. But when they measured it with an omer, those who gathered much had nothing over, and those who gathered little had no shortage. They gathered as much as each of them needed. So the manna economy is about everyone having enough and no one hoarding, but also no one lacking what they need.
Which is such an interesting connection, right, to the feeding of the 5,000.
Yeah.
Where in John they gathered the fragments, right, and from the fragments of 5 barley loaves and left by those who had eaten, and they filled 12 baskets.
Yeah. A kind of abundance.
Right, and that's such a key theme for the Gospel of John as well. I think another really interesting thing connected to freedom and how we navigate or negotiate that freedom with God, of that revelation of our character, because at the end of the Bread of Life discourse, the disciples complain. It's grumble, complain, same verb in the Septuagint. And Jesus says, they say, this is difficult. Who can accept this? Who can accept that you are the bread of life, the living bread that comes down from heaven? And Jesus says, does this offend you? And then some of the disciples walk away. And it's also the first time that Judas is introduced as the one who would betray him. So that navigation of freedom that God gives, but then how do you do that in relationship with God and with each other is, I think, another homiletical theme.
Thanks. I want to go back to the fact that the manna is this provision that's enough, like you were saying. It's a weird story.
Yeah.
I mean, the first part that's in the assigned reading for the week is weird enough, which is, you can gather it, but only gather as much as need. If you gather more, you're still only going to have an omer.
Yeah.
Which is like a half gallon.
Yeah.
And if you don't gather much, you're going to have a half gallon.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, then why work hard?
You know what I mean? I wouldn't work very hard. It's not like picking raspberries that you were talking about earlier today, Kathryn. It's like, you got to get out there. And then the next part, which we skip, we don't include, but you could talk about it, which is, and then on Friday, the day of preparation for the Sabbath, gather twice as much. That's the only day it won't go bad.
Right.
If you gather too much, it won't last overnight, except that,
Yeah.
on Friday, which is a weird part. So it's going back to Genesis. It's about the provision of enough of abundance, but also of Sabbath, of rest is part of the story too.
That it's not just about the work, it's about the character of the work, right?
Oh, interesting.
Even in gathering the manna, which is a good thing and a necessary thing, it's still important to observe Sabbath.
Another theme here, too, is, God provides because, God's there.
Yeah.
I mean, that's another really important aspect of this text is in the wilderness wanderings, right? God is present. God is still tenting or tabernacling with God's people, which is another theme one could connect to John. Of God, skenao, God is tenting now in the body of Jesus and is present among us. And will we recognize that or not? And so that constant presence of God is then also key. That's what God promises.
Mm-hmm.
One last connection, and this is with last week's reading. So last week's reading starts with God heard their complaints. So there's a form of complaining that they do when they're enslaved and being oppressed, and God hears their prayers. And then now they're complaining about God.
Yeah, right.
And God hears those prayers. So that when we pray, we can both complain to God, lifting up our sorrows that are caused by others, that are caused by ourself, if you go back to maybe Jacob.
Right.
And then also, even when we complain against God's very self, God will hear that. I Love to Tell the Story is a production of Luther Seminary's Working Preacher. The narrative lectionary was developed at Luther Seminary and has been hosted on Working Preacher since 2011. Find episodes and links at workingpreacher.org/narrative. And be sure to rate, subscribe, and comment on YouTube. Thanks for joining us.